I think the Russian uranium story is perhaps the most shocking and most blatant example of how the Clintons operate. This is a story about the Russian State Nuclear Agency, American uranium, $145 million in cash, and the Clintons.
At the end of the day, this is a story about buying influence and selling influence. The Clintons are the sellers of influence, the Canadian investors and the Russians are the buyers. Bill Clinton had gone to the Central Asian country of Kazakhstan in 2005 with Frank Giustra.
Kazakhstan is a country that's been run since the collapse of the Soviet Union by a dictator named Nazarbayev, who shuts down political opposition and tortures political opponents.
The ostensible purpose of the visit to Kazakhstan by Bill Clinton was to talk with Nazarbayev about AIDS HIV. The problem is Kazakhstan really does not have an AIDS HIV problem. So that explanation really doesn't make sense. What makes far more sense is that Frank Giustra wanted access to very lucrative Kazakh uranium mines.
Kazakhstan is one of the largest producers of uranium in the world. Bill Clinton arrives there with Frank Giustra, and they have a series of meetings with Kazakh officials. There's a press conference where Bill Clinton stands with the dictator of Kazakhstan and he praises the human rights record. He praises that elections are being held in the country, and he even says that Kazakhstan should head up something called the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Think about that for a second. Bill Clinton is saying that a known human rights violator who's been condemned by human rights organizations around the world should head up a human rights organization. They go from a press conference to a dinner where Frank Giustra, Nazarbayev, the dictator of Kazakhstan, and Bill Clinton meet and talk.
Well, 2 days after that meeting, Frank Giustra finally gets his uranium concessions,
worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A couple of weeks after that, Bill Clinton gets his $30 million from Frank Giustra, the first payment in what will become more than $100 million in pledges and commitments and donations made by Frank Giustra.
So it's really, in a way, a simple story in that they all are walking away from the table with something that they want. Nazarbayev is getting the legitimacy of an ex-president, saying what a nice and kind leader he is. Frank Giustra gets his uranium concession, and Bill Clinton and his foundation get cold, hard cash.
Now let's move to chapter 2 of this story, which is even more sinister. You see, the international uranium market is very competitive. The Kremlin sees dominance and control of the uranium market as a source of national power. Frank Giustra takes that uranium concession he got in Kazakhstan and puts it into a company in a so-called reverse merger, which was one way for a private company to go public to form something called Uranium One. It's a company traded on the stock market in Canada, and they start acquiring uranium concessions in places like Wyoming, Texas, New Mexico, and Utah. And by 2009, they have what is expected to be 50% of future uranium production in the United States. This gets the interest of Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. And in fact, there are State Department cables that were leaked through WikiLeaks, which show that Hillary was aware of the fact that the Russians took great care to try to dominate the international uranium market.
Well, the Russians want to buy this asset, and they offer a 40% overprice on the share of the stock. And for this transaction to go through, it has to be approved by the U.S. federal government. Why? Because uranium is regarded as a critical industry in the United States.
After all, this is used for our civilian nuclear reactors and goes into nuclear weapons. So it goes before the federal government, where it needs to be signed off by a series of federal agencies, including the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. As Hillary Clinton is contemplating this, shareholders in Uranium One, including Frank Giustra, have sent more than $145 million to the Clinton Foundation. The chairman of that company at the precise time is a guy named Ian Telfer, who is also making donations to the Clinton Foundation, as is Frank Holmes, who is another major Uranium One shareholder.
And Hillary Clinton, who has a record of opposing precisely these kinds of deals, comes out and says, you know what, I think this is a good deal. Let's let Vladimir Putin take control of what is now 20% of U.S. uranium production. Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are the only figures in American politics who are willing to do this deal and who could actually pull it off, because they had a reputation that runs so contrary to what they're doing. I mean, this is what the Clinton Foundation does, right? This is what they talk about politically, their support for human rights, their concerns about proliferation, their concerns about issues related to Russian aggression.
There's no doubt that when Putin came back in and said he was going to be president, that did change the relationship. We have to stand up to his bullying. And
what's so interesting when you consider this uranium deal are the actions of a small Canadian investment firm called Salida Capital. Salida Capital, in 2010, as this deal was going down, committed to give millions of dollars to the Clinton Foundation, and they also sponsored a speech by Bill Clinton in Canada. Salida Capital is also the name of a wholly owned subsidiary of Rosatom. Who is Rosatom? Well, this is the government agency in Russia that controls their nuclear arsenal, that built nuclear reactors in Iran, and engages in nuclear technology exchanges with rogue countries like North Korea.
What this means, in essence, is that the Russian government, specifically Rosatom, was funneling money through a subsidiary directly to the Clinton Foundation. But the payday didn't end there. 4 months before Hillary Clinton's State Department would sign off on the Russian purchase of Uranium-1, Bill Clinton got paid $500,000 to give a single speech in Moscow.
He was being paid by a firm called Renaissance Capital, which has a long history of association with Russian intelligence services. What makes this speech stand out is not only the timing of when he's being paid, but the amount that he's being paid. You see, the last time Bill Clinton gave a speech in Russia was 5 years earlier. At that time, he was paid about 1/3 of what he was being paid this time.
Why is Russian control of 20% of U.S. uranium so troubling?
If you're in an era where nuclear weapons are a reality, where nuclear energy is an important component of energy production in the United States, and increasingly around the world, control of uranium is absolutely crucial.
And unlike oil or natural gas can be found in so many places around the world, there are precious few places where you can find significant and large amounts of uranium that you can produce on a commercial scale. What we've essentially done is handed this precious resource to Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. They're not only engaged in aggression in places like Ukraine, but they've been very aggressive in fighting American interests around the globe. Russia's not an ally. Russia's not a friend. Vladimir Putin's Russia is a rival of the United States, and yet we've given them control over this precious resource.
Uranium, the key mineral in nuclear generation, is a domestic resource.
This is what's going to power America.
I think a lot of people in Middle America would be surprised to know that the Russian government is doing business in places like Colorado or Wyoming or Utah. These are small mining towns. These are operations that have existed for a while, that have been under the control of American companies or for a while Canadian companies. But it's now Russian companies that control this, and those companies are controlled by the Russian government. Having read through the archives of the KGB, the files that they have been released, I can tell you that they look at the United States as weak and ineffectual. This is a thuggish government that is engaged in massive human rights violations. There are opponents of this regime that have been killed or have disappeared. There's been persecution of human rights organizations. There's been persecution of homosexuals. And it's shocking and stunning to me that there has not been more attention focused to this fact, that we have given this critical resource to somebody who is engaged in so much nefarious behavior.